For 5 days, the skies over Iran were quiet. No new strikes, no new headlines, no press conference, just silence. The same kind of engineered silence this channel has tracked through every phase of this war. A pause is never peace. A pause is a clock. And nobody outside a small circle of officials in Washington and Tehran ever knows exactly how long that clock is set to run. That clock just ran out. On the night of July 29th, U.S. Central Command confirmed what it called a heavy wave of strikes against Iranian military capabilities. Not a single retaliatory hit, a wave. And by the time this video ends, you're going to understand exactly why that word wave was chosen deliberately, why the 5 days before it matter as much as the strikes themselves, and why what happened in the 48 hours around it should concern you more than the bombing campaign that everyone is already talking about. Before I go further, do 3 things. Hit like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. This conflict is now moving faster than the mainstream news cycle can track it, and the threads I'm about to walk you through, the ones connecting Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia into a single week of escalation, are not being connected anywhere else right now. If this channel's tracking of this war has been useful to you before, this is the episode where it matters most. Let's start by rebuilding the timeline properly, because the mainstream coverage has been reporting each of this week's events as isolated stories. They are not isolated. They are one story, and once you see the connections, you will not be able to unsee them. To understand why 5 days of silence ended in a heavy wave of strikes, you need to understand what this war actually is, because it did not begin last week, and it did not begin with missiles. This phase of the conflict traces back to February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran, opening what is now being referred to as the 2026 Iran War. Those opening strikes did something no conflict between these two countries had ever done before. They targeted Iranian officials and military commanders directly, and in the process, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. For the first time in the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic, the man at the absolute center of its political and religious authority was gone, removed not by internal upheaval, but by external strike. Iran's response came fast. Missile and drone strikes against Israel, against American forces stationed across the region, and eventually against countries with no direct role in the conflict at all, drawn in simply because American bases sit inside their borders. That is the pattern you need to hold on to for the rest of this video. American military infrastructure exists inside sovereign countries, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Iraq, that did not choose this war, and every time Iran responds to a U.S. strike by hitting a U.S. base, it is technically striking the territory of a country that is not the United States. That single geographic fact is the mechanism by which a 2-country war becomes a 6-country war, and it is happening again right now, in real time, this week. Through the spring, the pattern repeated in cycles. Strikes, pauses, negotiations that opened and then collapsed before they could produce anything durable. By June, delegations from the U.S. and Iran had entered formal negotiations aimed at a war-ending deal, built around a memorandum of understanding both countries had signed. And yet, even while those talks were underway, the two countries continued to exchange strikes, with the Strait of Hormuz sitting at the center of the tension the entire time. Because whoever controls the risk to shipping through that strait controls a lever that touches the price of oil on every continent on Earth. That is the state this war was sitting in 10 days ago, paused, negotiating, but never actually stopped. And then Iran fired on a U.S. base in Jordan. Here is the confirmed sequence, pieced together from CENTCOM's own statement, from reporting out of Baghdad, Cairo, and Riyadh, and from Iranian state media accounts that, for once, largely agree with the Western timeline on the basic order of events, even if they disagree completely on who bears responsibility for starting it. 2 days before the heavy wave, Iranian forces struck a U.S. base in Jordan. 3 American soldiers were killed. That is the event CENTCOM's statement pointed to directly as the reason the 5-day pause ended and the wave of strikes on the night of the 29th was launched. But that single strike on Jordan was not an isolated Iranian action. In the same 48-hour window, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps struck U.S. positions across 3 separate countries, Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, simultaneously. According to the IRGC's own public statement, this 3-country strike was retaliation for an earlier American strike on a building on Iran's Qeshm island, a strike that, according to Iranian accounts, killed a couple and their 2-year-old child. I want you to sit with that fact before we go any further, because it changes the moral and political shape of everything that follows. A toddler is dead. And whatever you personally believe about who bears ultimate responsibility for this phase of the war, that single fact is now sitting inside every diplomatic conversation happening this week in Washington, in Tehran, in Muscat, and in Riyadh, whether any of those governments wants it there or not. Dead children do not stay contained to the news cycle that reports them. They become justification, they become propaganda, And on both sides of a conflict like this one, they become the reason the next escalation is considered acceptable when it otherwise would not have been. So here's the first question I want you to answer honestly in the comments before you hear the rest of this analysis. When a war reaches the point where a 2-year-old's death becomes the stated justification for firing on 3 separate U.S. military installations in 3 separate sovereign countries, is that still a contained regional conflict? Or has it already become something categorically different? Leave your answer below. I genuinely want to know what you think before we go further, because I'm going to come back to this exact question at the end of the video, and I want to compare where your thinking starts against where it ends. While the world's attention was fixed on the exchange between Iran and the United States, something happened on July the 29th that deserves far more scrutiny than it has received. A drone strike hit 2 ships in the port of Damietta, Egypt, setting at least 1 vessel on fire. As of this recording, nobody has claimed responsibility. If that strike is confirmed as deliberate, it will mark the first time Egypt has been pulled directly into this conflict's blast radius. And I want you to think carefully about why that matters. Because Egypt is not just another country on a map. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, one of only a handful of choke points on the planet through which a staggering share of global maritime trade physically has to pass. If Egypt is now inside the blast radius of this war, the conversation stops being about the Strait of Hormuz alone. It becomes about 2 of the world's most important shipping choke points sitting inside the same active conflict zone at the same time. Contacts between Egyptian and Iranian foreign ministries reportedly intensified during the broader U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran, which tells you Cairo has been trying to manage its exposure diplomatically for months. The Damietta strike suggests that diplomacy may not be enough anymore. Here is the development I think is the single most underreported story of this entire week. And it's the reason this episode's title promises that something happened after the heavy wave, rather than simply saying the war continued. In direct response to the widening blast radius, Damietta, the drone and missile activity connected to Saudi infrastructure, the general sense across the Gulf that shipping lanes are no longer reliably safe, Saudi Arabia's defense ministry announced this week that 14 countries have now backed a proposal to establish what is being called a Maritime Defense Alliance. Its stated purpose? Protecting international shipping routes and global trade from exactly the kind of spillover that just hit Damietta. 14 countries. Now, put that number next to 2 other numbers from this same week. 3, the American soldiers killed in Jordan. 1, the Iranian toddler killed on Qeshm Island. 3 deaths, 1 dead child. 14 nations formed a new permanent security architecture in direct response. That ratio tells you something the casualty count alone never could. This war has stopped being measured only in strikes and started being measured in the permanent structures it is leaving behind in its wake. Ceasefires end. Pauses end, as we just watched happen after 5 days. But multinational defense alliances do not dissolve the moment the missiles stop. Whatever happens with the diplomacy over Iran in the coming weeks or months, that 14-nation coalition Saudi Arabia just assembled is not going away. It is now a permanent feature of the regional security landscape, built in the shadow of this war, and it will outlast whatever ceasefire or settlement eventually ends the shooting. Ask yourself this, and put your answer in the comments. When a 14-nation coalition forms specifically because of spillover from a 2-country war, has the actual center of gravity in this conflict already shifted? Away from the capitals doing the fighting, Washington and Tehran, and toward the capital doing the organizing, Riyadh? There's a second thread from this week that received almost no coverage outside specialist outlets, and it may be the clearest preview available right now of exactly how a regional war spreads without a single new front being formally declared. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry stated this week that drone strikes launched from Iraqi territory had targeted Saudi critical infrastructure and the capital, Riyadh, on 2 consecutive days. In response, Iraq's Ministerial Council for National Security convened an emergency meeting, chaired by the Iraqi Prime Minister in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The outcome of that meeting, delivered through a government spokesperson to state-run media, was a direct denial. No party has provided evidence to substantiate the claim that Iraqi territory was used to launch the strikes. Read that exchange carefully, because this is precisely the mechanism by which regional wars actually grow. Nobody fired a shot between Baghdad and Riyadh this week, but the accusation itself functions as a form of escalation. Because a country that has to convene an emergency National Security Council session specifically to publicly deny hosting attacks against a neighbor is no longer a bystander in the eyes of the region. It has become a suspect. And suspects get treated differently, diplomatically, economically, and eventually militarily, than bystanders do. This is how you get from a 2-country war to a 6-country war without anyone ever announcing that the war has widened. An accusation here, a drone strike with no claimed responsibility there. An emergency session in a capital that was never supposed to be part of this story. And then one day, you look at the map, and the list of countries actively involved has quietly doubled in size. with no single moment you can point to as the instant it happened. Let's go back to the language CENTCOM used, because military communications are never accidental, and the specific phrase chosen to describe an operation tells you almost as much as the operation itself. Heavy wave is not the language of a country that has decided to resume a sustained, open-ended air campaign. It is the language of a military that wants to draw a hard, visible line under a specific escalation, the strike on Jordan, while still leaving room to say the 5-day pause could, in principle, resume once the message has been received. CENTCOM did not describe this as the reopening of a new campaign. It described it as a direct response to a specific attack. That distinction matters, because it tells you Washington is still trying, at least publicly, to frame this as retaliation rather than reinvasion, even as the number of countries physically absorbing strikes around it keeps climbing. But here is the strategic paradox sitting at the center of this entire episode, and it's the reason intent and outcome are two very different things in a war like this one. You can genuinely intend a strike to be contained, proportional retaliation, and still watch it become the spark that pulls in a 4th, 5th, and 6th country. Because the moment IRGC-aligned forces answered a strike on Qeshm Island by hitting 3 separate U.S. bases in 3 separate sovereign states, the question of who is actually a combatant in this war stopped having a clean, stable answer. This is worth comparing to a moment from history that almost nobody covering this week's news has raised. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet ships carrying nuclear missiles toward Cuba turned around before crossing the American naval quarantine line. That turning around was not a Soviet military defeat. The ships were never intercepted or sunk. It was a strategic communication. It said, "We see the line you drew, we are choosing not to cross it, and the fact that we are choosing means we retain the option to choose differently later." A 5-day pause followed by a calibrated heavy wave, not an open-ended campaign, a specific, named response to a specific attack, is Washington doing something structurally similar. It is a message about control, not a declaration of unrestrained war. The question the next 72 hours will answer is whether Tehran, Baghdad, Riyadh, and Cairo read that signal correctly, or whether the accusations and denials already spiraling between them make a controlled signal impossible to receive cleanly. There's a dimension to this story that deserves its own space, because it explains why the reaction to this week's events has been so different in Riyadh than it has been in Washington. Every time tension spikes in this region, the first thing global energy markets watch is not troop movements or political statements. It's tanker traffic through the 2 choke points we've already discussed. Hormuz, and now, potentially, the waters near Suez. During the 5-day pause that just ended, oil prices had actually been easing, a sign that markets were cautiously pricing in the possibility that this quiet period might hold. The Damietta strike and the resumption of active combat operations puts that entire pricing model back into question overnight. This is precisely why Saudi Arabia moved as fast as it did to assemble a 14-nation maritime coalition. It is not simply a diplomatic gesture. It is an attempt to ensure the one thing that matters most to every economy connected to Gulf energy exports: the physical safety of the ships that move that energy to the rest of the world, against a war that keeps proving it cannot be reliably contained to the 2 countries that started it. There's a second economic thread worth pulling on here too. Sustained air campaigns like this one are not free in the way casual coverage often implies. Every interceptor fired to defend a base, every Patriot battery reloaded, every additional carrier group repositioned into the region costs money, and more importantly, costs inventory that cannot be instantly replaced. A prolonged pause, followed by a sudden heavy wave, is also, in part, a story about how much capacity a military wants to spend in a single night versus how much it wants to hold in reserve for whatever comes after this week. Every strike you saw reported is also a quiet decision about next month's stockpile. Here is the truth sitting underneath everything we've walked through in this video. This war has now reached a stage where every single party involved is technically responding to something specific. Iran says it is responding to the strike on Qeshm Island. The United States says it is responding to the strike in Jordan. Saudi Arabia is responding to Damietta and to the drone strikes on Riyadh. Iraq is responding to an accusation it says has no evidence behind it. And yet the sum of all of these individually justified, individually specific responses is a regional conflict that is larger this week than it was last week. It was larger last week than the week before that. Nobody currently involved in this conflict believes they are the party escalating it. Every single one of them believes they are the party responding to someone else's escalation. And that, historically, is exactly the condition under which regional wars stop being containable. Not because any single government wants a wider war, but because every government involved is convinced that its own next move is purely defensive, even as the sum of all of those defensive moves keeps expanding the map. So here's where I want to leave you, and I want you to bring the same seriousness to this that this channel's audience has brought to every episode in this series so far, because your read on where this goes next has consistently been sharper than most of the professional coverage of this war. Go back to the question I asked you at the start of this video. When a war reaches the point where a dead child becomes the stated justification for strikes on 3 separate countries, is that still contained? Now ask yourself the second question this episode has built toward. When a 14-nation alliance forms in direct response to that spillover, has the diplomatic center of gravity in this entire conflict already shifted away from Washington and Tehran, and toward the coalition Riyadh just built to survive them both? Tell me what you think will happen in the next 30 days. Tell me which of this week's threads, the toddler on Qeshm Island, the 3 soldiers in Jordan, the unclaimed strike in Damietta, the accusation against Iraq, or the 14-nation alliance, you believe will matter most a month from now, when we look back on this week as the moment something changed. This channel builds every one of these breakdowns from what has actually been confirmed, not from speculation. And the comments section under these videos has consistently been ahead of the mainstream coverage on where this war goes next. Let's see if that holds true again. I'll see you in the next one.